The Senate is considering the point of order presented by the Majority Leader.
Madam President.
Senator from Texas.
Madam President, I rise to make a motion. The Majority Leader has argued that Secretary Mayorkas's defiance of federal immigration law and active aiding and abetting of the worst criminal invasion in our nation's history does not constitute a high crime or misdemeanor. He has presented no argument on that question. He has presented no briefing on that question, and the position is directly contrary to the Constitution, to the original understanding of the Constitution at the time it was ratified, and to the explicit position of the Biden Department of Justice as argued before the Supreme Court of the United States. The Majority Leader's position is asking members of this Senate to vote on political expediency to avoid listening to arguments. The only rational way to resolve this question is actually to debate it, to consider the Constitution and consider the law.
The Senator will recognize that the Senate is in a non-debatable position. The Senator has a right to offer his point of order, or his motion, but we are in a non-debatable position.
And my motion is to change that so that we can actually debate the law if senators care what the Constitution and law says. I therefore move that the Senate proceed to closed session to allow for deliberation on the question as required by Impeachment Rule 24.
Madam President.
Majority Leader.
In our previous consent request, we gave your side a chance for debate in public, where it should be, and your side objected. We are moving forward.
From Kansas is not wrong. In the 237 years of our nation's history, I don't know that there has been a more shameful day in the United States Senate than today. What we just witnessed was a travesty. It was a travesty to the United States Constitution, and it was a travesty to the American people. And it's important to understand why the Democrats did what they did. We're here on the Senate floor right now, but I want the record to reflect I'm going to do a very accurate count of the number of Democrats who are with us. That would be 0, other than the presiding officer, and somebody has to preside. Not a single Democrat senator chose to come to this floor and listen to one word of evidence. When it comes to the Constitution, the Democrats concluded that Joe Biden and Alejandro Mayorkas defying federal law, ignoring the text of the statute, deliberately releasing criminal illegal aliens over and over and over again, that's just hunky-dory. You can't impeach him for that. Every Democrat just voted. By the way, every cabinet member, guess what? You've just been given a blank slate. Ignore the law. When Democrats are in charge of the Senate, the entire cabinet could ignore the law. It is no longer impeachable in Democrat wonderland when a member of the executive branch openly defies the law. By the way, every Democrat just voted that way. They didn't hear one word of argument. The Majority Leader didn't stand up and say, here's the reason why it's okay. No, he didn't present that argument. They didn't read a brief. Nobody wrote a brief. They didn't care enough to know what Senator Lee just laid out, that the Biden Department of Justice went in front of the U.S. Supreme Court and said if the executive defies the law, the answer is impeachment. The willingness of every Democrat to be blatantly hypocritical. Just last year, the Biden Justice Department said, no, you can't sue in court when we, the Biden administration, defy the law. The answer is impeachment. In like 3-card money. Every Senate Democrat said, no, the answer is not impeachment. I don't know what it is. Actually, I do know what it is. There's only one answer left, which is everyone who is unhappy about the open border shows up in November, and to use the phrase, throw the bums out. Because if you're not willing to do your job, is there not one senator on that side of the aisle who cares enough to honor the Constitution? By the way, the second article they threw out said lying to Congress is not a high crime or misdemeanor, it's not impeachable. Now, as the senator from South Carolina pointed out, Bill Clinton was impeached for lying under oath. And you know what happened? And he was ultimately acquitted. But after a full trial where they heard the evidence, where the Senate did its job. By the way, one of the impeachment managers was Senator Graham, who presented that evidence right here on this floor. And you know what? Before Bill Clinton, there's a guy named Walter Nixon. You may not know who Walter Nixon is. Walter Nixon was a federal judge who was convicted of perjury. He was from Mississippi. He was convicted of perjury in front of a grand jury. And he was impeached. And it went to the Senate, and the Senate convicted him and removed him from the bench. So you want to know what the precedents were prior to today? You commit a crime, lying under oath, perjury, it is a high crime or misdemeanor that is impeachable. No more. Because understand the Democrats' rule here. This is not about the Constitution. None of them care. By the way, we repeatedly moved. Let's go into debate. Hear the other side of the argument. Nope. Look, the famous three monkeys, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. That's just evil, what they did. They don't want to know because they don't care, because it's not about the Constitution. It's not about the law. It is about political expediency. But every bit as violent as what they did to the Constitution was, it's even more offensive what they did to the American people. Last year, 853 migrants died crossing illegally into this country. That's almost 3 a day. You go down to the southern border, you go down to Texas, which the Democrats don't bother to do because they don't care about the people dying. And you see photograph after photograph that Texas farmers and ranchers are finding of dead bodies on their property. Many of my colleagues here have been down there with me, have seen the elderly people the human traffickers have abandoned, have seen the pregnant women the human traffickers have abandoned, have seen the infants and toddlers left to die. The Senate Democrats just told the American people they don't give a damn about the bodies and the people who have died the last 3.5 years, and they don't give a damn about the people that are going to die next week. Next week, more migrants are going to die. When we brought 19 senators down to the border, we went out on a boat in the Rio Grande. We saw a man floating dead in the water. Senator Lee was there. Senator Kennedy was there. He had died that day. The Democrats just told the American people they don't care. When you go down to the border and you look at the children who've been brutalized, just about all of us here are parents. I will tell you, when you look in the eye of a little girl or a little boy who's been abused by traffickers, and you see it, you see the pain, you see the agony of children trapped in sex trafficking, the Democrats just said they don't care. They won't hear the evidence, they don't care that it's deliberate, and they don't care that it'll happen next week, that it'll happen tomorrow. Tomorrow there will be children brutalized because of the Democrats' open border policies, and not a one of them cares. They don't care about the women who are repeatedly sexually assaulted. Again, when you look at the eyes of these women coming over, it's heartbreaking. And the Democrats just said, we don't care. And they don't care about the more than 100,000 Americans that died last year from drug overdoses. The highest in our nation's history. 70% of that is from Chinese fentanyl coming across our southern border. And the Democrats said, we don't want to hear about it. We're not interested in the Americans dying. You know what they also don't care about? They don't care about the criminals that are being released day after day after day. The Biden administration is releasing murderers and rapists and child molesters, and every week we see another story of somebody being killed, somebody being raped, another child being assaulted by illegal immigrants released by Alejandro Mayorkas and Joe Biden. How shocking is it that there wasn't one Democrat who says, you know, massive human suffering matters? We ought to hear the evidence. How shocking is it that there wasn't one Democrat? One! There are 51 of them on that side. Not a single one could screw up the courage to say, let's do our job, let's hear the evidence. How shocking is it that not a Democrat cares about the terrorists who are streaming across our southern border? The nation of Iran has called for jihad against America. Hamas has called for jihad against America. Hezbollah has called for jihad against America. And Joe Biden and the Democrats have put out a red carpet and said, if you want to murder Americans, come across our southern border, and we, the Democrats, will welcome you. Like many of us on this floor, I was in Washington, D.C. on September 11th, 2001. I remember the horror. I lost a good friend, Barbara Olson, who was in the plane that crashed into the Pentagon. I remember the smell of smoke and sulfur and burning. I remember the agony, and I remember the national unity that came after 9/11. As Democrats and Republicans came together, I don't know that I've ever been more proud of a president than when President George W. Bush stood on a pile of rubble with a bullhorn, talking to firefighters and New Yorkers, and one of the men in the crowd called out and said, "We can't hear you," and he responded, "Well, I can hear you, and soon the whole world is going to hear you as well." We were as one. Today, not a single Democrat was able to mount up the courage to tell the majority leader, you know what, I don't want another 9/11 to happen. The House impeached Alejandro Mayorkas for, among other things, releasing terrorist after terrorist after terrorist. We ought to hear the evidence. I believe today we have a greater risk of a major terrorist attack on U.S. soil than at any point since September 11th. And every Democrat just told the American people it doesn't matter to them to hear the evidence. I appreciate my Republican colleagues who are here, who are willing to hear the evidence, willing to engage, willing to stand up and defend the American people. But you know what? The Democrats who aren't here, they aren't here because you know who's also not here? If you look up at the gallery, the reporters are all gone. A couple of folks in the back, I hope you're all right. But the reporters are absent. That's the Democrats' plan. What is fascinating, we're presenting arguments. Many of us, particularly those of us in judiciary, but many of us have presented those arguments over and over and over again in hearings. Not a Democrat argues on the other side. It's an issue unlike any other issue I know of in politics. Listen, if we're arguing about taxes, as Republicans, we say we should cut taxes. It's good for the American people. And you know what Democrats do? They stand up. We know their talking points. No, tax the rich. Okay, fine, we have a debate. We're talking about just about every issue. The Democrats will argue on the other side. They have their spin. What is fascinating? Where's Dick Durbin, chairman of the Judiciary Committee, standing up saying, no, it's not right that migrants are dying every day. No, it's not right that children are being assaulted every day. No, it's not right that women are being sexually assaulted every day. No, it's not right that they're releasing terrorists every day. They're not there. Not a Democrat is there. Why? Because you cannot defend it. I'll tell you, South Texas for 100+ years has been a Democrat region of our state. It is turning red with the speed of a freight locomotive because nobody can see the suffering that is unfolding and defend it. And the Democrats, by their silence and by the complicity of the press corps, they are counting on the press corps to write story. Victory for the Democrats, yay! They got rid of the impeachment trial. That's the headline they want. Understand they don't have a substantive defense. None of them disputes a word we are saying. Not a single Democrat has stood up and said, you know, it's wrong that Laken Riley would still be alive if Joe Biden hadn't let her murderer go. They know it's right. The reason they didn't want a trial is they don't want the American people to hear about it. And it's our obligation to make sure the American people do.
In a few moments, I will make a unanimous consent request on a bill on airline slots. sponsored by Senators Warner and Kaine. And I'm here for the sake of fairness. There are very strong feelings on both sides of this issue. It is not partisan, but rather different people have different opinions. The proper and fair and only right thing to do is have a vote and let the body decide. I yield to the senator from Virginia, the senior senator from Virginia, to explain his amendment.
Mr. President.
Senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I thank the Majority Leader for making this UC request. I've been in this body since early 2009. This issue, which we are debating about the so-called slots at DCA, is a perennial one. People feel very strongly on both sides. There's never been a time since I've been in this Senate that there was not either a bipartisan agreement to resolve this issue before it came to the floor, or a debate on the floor which resulted in a vote. Sometimes, as part of the states, Virginia and Maryland, that don't want additional slots, we've been successful. Sometimes we've not. But each and every time, there has been a vote. Matter of fact, if we look over at the proceedings on this bill in the House, the managers of those bills, thought they had some sense of what should be included in or not included in the slot debate. But the House of Representatives actually had a vote. And to the surprise of the managers of the bill, slots were completely eliminated from that piece of legislation. Now, I'm not going to sit here and rehash all of the statistics. What is clear, though, is that the single busiest runway in the United States of America is not at DFW, it's not in New York, it's not in Seattle, it's not in Atlanta, it is at National Airport. And an airport that was originally constructed for 15 million passengers with 3 runways, which allows some distribution of those flights. Now, because of the lack of turboplanes and prop planes, we have an airport that handles 25 million passengers last year, 90% of all that traffic on a single runway. Now, my friends who don't agree with this, and as the Majority Leader said, it's not a partisan issue, it comes on both sides, have said, no, Senator Kaine, Senator Warner, you're wrong. This won't add to delay. It won't add more cancellations. It was a one-off a few weeks ago when 2 airplanes came within a few hundred feet of a collision. It won't add any additional safety concerns. So in an effort to try to meet folks halfway, we have amended the original Kaine amendment, which said, let's just have an up or down vote on slots, and said, no, let's allow the 5 slots if and only if the Secretary of Transportation certifies that no additional safety concerns will be raised, the traveling public won't be impaired, there won't be any additional cancellations, there won't be any additional delays. All things the opposition have said, add these slots, there's no problem. Well, let's not have Congress weigh in on something that, frankly, we don't have the expertise to weigh in on in the first place. Let's give it to the Secretary of Transportation to make that determination on passenger safety, on cancellations, on delays. Let's let the professionals make that decision. That's what our amendment does. And again, I'm going to yield now to my friend, the fellow senator from Virginia, Senator Kaine, and again, thank the Majority Leader for making this request.
Thank you, Senator Warner, and I also want to thank the Senate Majority Leader, Mr. President. I have spoken on the floor a number of times about this, and I don't need to rehash the deep concern I have about the excessive delay that already exists at Reagan National, the excessive cancellations that already exist at Reagan National, the excessive need to put planes into holding patterns circling over a city with very restricted airspace at Reagan National. I deeply oppose the jamming of more flights onto this runway, and I opposed that it was done with no involvement from Virginians whatsoever, no opportunity for us to weigh in. We're not on the Commerce Committee, and so the only way we have to have an impact on this is to have an amendment on the floor, and we may win it or we may lose it, but this is our hometown airport. It's all being done without us, and the only impact we have is to be able to do something on the floor. And so the proposed amendment that I introduced was simply to strip the slots, to follow the advice of the FAA, to follow the advice of the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority, to follow the advice of people who know what they're doing so as to avoid a potential catastrophe. I'm not going to get that amendment. I'm not going to get that amendment. So instead, what Senator Warner has done, together with our Maryland colleagues, is proposed a compromise. We will accept the 5 slots. 5 slots are equal to 10 flights if, as Senator Warner indicates, the Secretary of Transportation says, with respect to each slot, it will not increase delay, it will not raise the risk of cancellation, it will not risk passenger safety. We should all want that, not only for the airport that the capital region uses, but for all airports, not increasing delay, not increasing safety risk, not increasing cancellation risk. And so that's what this amendment is. We want to vote on our amendment about our hometown airport, and we've offered a compromise to protect safety and the convenience of passengers. And I would hope that my colleagues would see fit to allow the home state senators in whose territory this airport is to at least have an amendment vote. And with that, I yield back to the Majority Leader.
President, let me just reiterate, for the sake of fairness, it's only the right thing to do to allow a vote. We don't know what the outcome will be, but it is very fair to have a vote. And therefore, I ask unanimous consent that the only amendment in order to the Cantwell-Cruz substitute amendment number 1911 as modified be Warner Amendment 2057, and that at time to be determined by the Majority Leader in consultation with the Republican Leader, the Senate vote on the amendment. Further, upon disposition of the Warner Amendment, all post-cloture time on substitute Amendment 1911 as modified and as amended, if amended, be considered expired and all remaining amendments be withdrawn. That upon disposition of the substitute amendment number 1911 as modified and as amended, if amended, the cloture motion with respect to the underlying bill be withdrawn, that the bill as amended, if amended, be read a 3rd time, and the Senate vote on passage of the bill as amended with a 60-vote affirmative threshold required for passage, and with 2 minutes for debate prior to each vote, all without further intervening action or debate.
Are there any objections?
Mr. President.
The senator from Texas.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, let me say I appreciate the passion of my colleagues from Virginia. I've served with both of them for 12 years. Senator Kaine and I both were elected together in 2012. He and I have worked together on many issues, and I anticipate we will work together on many issues going forward. On this issue, he and I see the issue very differently. This bill that is before the Senate is a bill that moved forward the right way. It moved forward, frankly, a way I wish a lot more legislation proceeded in the Senate. This bill proceeded through regular order. It began in committee. The Commerce Committee took it up. We had a series of markups scheduled over several months. In the process of drafting this bill, we solicited the input initially of every senator on the Commerce Committee. And every single senator, Democrat and Republican, has priorities that are reflected in the underlying bill that were adopted. After the bill came out of the Commerce Committee, we solicited the input of every other senator, those not on the Commerce Committee, for their ideas, their priorities for their respective states. This bill contains over 200 member priorities from Democrats and Republicans reflecting the different needs and the different priorities of our 50 states. In addition to all of those, This week, we added 9 more amendments in a manager's package when the Majority Leader laid down the substitute earlier this week. This is an amendment that reflects the consensus view of this body, which is why I anticipate shortly we will see an overwhelming bipartisan vote passing the FAA bill. Now, on the question of slots, in the committee initially, an amendment was offered by Senator Raphael Warnock, a Democrat from Georgia, to expand the number of slots at D.C. Reagan Airport by 28 slots. That was an amendment that had a lot in its favor, but it also prompted furious lobbying on the other side. Ultimately, what the committee did is work to seek common ground, work to seek a compromise. Senator Warnock's amendment of 28 slots was not adopted. Instead, what was adopted was an amendment that I drafted, working hand in hand with the chairman of the committee, Senator Cantwell, that went down from 28 slots to merely 5 slots. Now, several arguments have been raised against creating any additional slots at Reagan. One argument is pointing to the recent near miss at DCA Reagan as evidence that no additional flights can go into or out of Reagan. However, it is worth noting that the FAA experts have recently clarified that this near miss had absolutely nothing to do with traffic on the runway, that it was unrelated issues that produced the near miss, and I might note those unrelated issues include what this underlying bill addresses, which is ensuring we have sufficient air traffic controllers to monitor the traffic and protect safety. Another argument used by opponents of adding new flights to Reagan is the argument that DCA was originally designed to accommodate 15 million passengers annually, and that in 2023 it served 25.5 million passengers. What that argument fails to acknowledge is that DCA has made significant investments to increase capacity, including adding more gates and expanding terminals. Opponents of additional flights have also claimed that DCA is overburdened by its current flights and that DCA flights are already delayed. What that argument omits is the fact that DCA has a better on-time arrival rate than either Dulles or BWI. It has the best on-time arrival rate of the 3 airports in this immediate vicinity. I would note the most voracious opposition to this amendment comes from lobbying on behalf of United Airlines. And the reason is not complicated to ascertain. United has a near monopoly position at Dulles Airport. And United understandably wants to preserve its monopoly profits. 5 new flights into and out of Reagan Airport would provide additional competition that would predictably lower the price of tickets. It's not surprising that United Airlines doesn't want tickets to go down. They want to continue charging monopoly prices. I will point out for the people of Virginia and the people of Maryland and the people of D.C., limiting supply, allowing United to reap monopoly profits, and raising prices is not a good outcome. And for that reason, this bill as drafted, with the new flights, will benefit the people of Virginia, the people of Maryland, and the people of D.C. Indeed, in a recent poll, 67% of Northern Virginians support adding flights to DCA. This bill improves competition, and in terms of the overall traffic, there are right now 800 slots at D.C. Reagan. When this bill is adopted, it will go from 800 to 805. So it is a small, reasonable increase. I would also point out DCA Reagan is the only airport in the country that has federal slot control and a restriction on long-haul flights. This restriction is in no other airline in the country, and there's a long protectionist history as to why this one airport is subject to these restrictions. I want to make one final point. In addition to being a benefit for everyone going to our nation's capital or from our nation's capital, a benefit that impacts the entire country, Americans from all 50 states travel to Washington, D.C., to our nation's capital, whether it's school kids coming to tour the Capitol, whether it's families coming to the Smithsonian, whether it is people coming to the Holocaust Museum or the Lincoln Memorial, whether it's people coming to see the cherry blossoms. Everyone coming to and from D.C. will benefit from this provision, but there's also a very particular benefit to my home state of Texas, and that understandably is near and dear to my heart. This issue first came to my attention about 3 years ago. And it came to my attention because a delegation from the city of San Antonio came to my office. That delegation included business leaders, it included community leaders, it included elected leaders in San Antonio, most of whom are Democrats. And to a person, they were deeply, deeply dismayed that the city of San Antonio does not have even one direct flight to DCA Reagan. Now, San Antonio is today the 7th largest city in America. San Antonio is the 2nd largest city in Texas. San Antonio actually has a higher population than Dallas, Texas. San Antonio also has an enormous military population. Indeed, the city's nickname is Military City, USA. And there's an enormous population of active duty military and veterans who live in San Antonio. DCA Reagan is right next to the Pentagon, and it's right next to Arlington Memorial Cemetery. I can tell you the community of San Antonio is united on a bipartisan basis that San Antonio deserves a direct flight to and from Reagan, that it will save money for residents of San Antonio, that it will generate jobs for residents of San Antonio, and that it is only fair for residents of San Antonio that they be able to come directly to DCA Reagan. And as a result of this bill that the Senate is preparing to vote on, San Antonio is going to win a major bipartisan vote to get that flight. And my final observation, Senator Warner said in the past, a bipartisan compromise had been reached on this issue. I would note that happened here too. This bill that was voted out of committee was a bipartisan compromise. It was a compromise that was negotiated between me, the ranking member on the committee, and Senator Cantwell, the chairman of the committee, a Republican and a Democrat. And this provision was added to the bill and voted out of the committee unanimously. Every Democrat voted for it, every Republican voted for it, because it is a reasonable provision that benefits consumers and is fair. Therefore, Mr. President, I object.
Senator from Texas.
Madam President, I want to thank the senator from Iowa for her legislation, important legislation protecting the right to birth control and making it easier for women to have access to birth control pills over the counter. This is something we all agree on. This is something Americans across this nation agree upon. This is a right that is protected in all 50 states. In just a few minutes, we're going to see Democrats engage in a show vote, and there's a reason for that show vote. Because Democrats in the Senate, every one of them, their views on abortion are extreme and radical. Every Democrat in this body has voted repeatedly in favor of unlimited abortion on demand, literally up until the moment of birth. Partial birth abortion in the 39th and 40th week of pregnancy. That's an extreme position. I'll tell you, nationally, 9% of Americans agree with that position. 91% of Americans look at that extreme position and say, that's too far. And indeed, even among those Americans who call themselves pro-choice, a majority of pro-choice Americans say late-term abortions up until the moment of birth, that is extreme. So what do the Democrats do? They recognize that 91% of Americans disagree with their extreme position, so they try to change the topic. And in particular, they're trying to change the topic to birth control. Now, all 100 senators, every single senator agrees that birth control should be protected as a matter of law. And yet, what did we just see? We saw Senator Ernst introducing her legislation of which I'm a co-sponsor. Together, we're leading the fight to protect the right to birth control. And what happened? The Democrats objected. Why did they object? Understand why they objected. Because they want to use this as an issue in November to scare people, and they don't want to talk about their own radical record. Instead, they want to falsely claim somebody is coming to take contraception. That is deliberately false. And so when you see millions of dollars of TV ads paid for by Democrats Ask yourself one question. Why did the Democrats just block Senator Ernst's legislation protecting the right to birth control? Because this is not about protecting this right. It is about politics for the Democrats hiding their own radical view. I wish we would come together. By the way, next week I predict the Democrats are going to do the same thing. I have legislation protecting in vitro fertilization, another incredible medical miracle that, again, to the best of my knowledge, all 100 senators support. Katie Britt and I together have introduced that legislation, and yet I fully expect next week the Democrats to do what they just did today, which is object to it because they're playing politics and they're unwilling to actually put in federal law a real and strong protection. I know it's campaign season, but it is unfortunate that Democrats are not willing to work together. Had they not uttered two words, I object, Senator Ernst's legislation protecting the right to birth control would have passed out of this body. But Senate Democrats didn't want it to. I yield the floor. President, I rise at a time of widespread and acute peril for the national security of the United States and for America's allies. Led by China, our enemies and our adversaries, Russia, Iran, North Korea, are actively cooperating to target us and our allies all over the world. In extreme cases, Mr. President, they seek nothing less than the physical annihilation of the countries they're targeting. In Europe, Russia has launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In Asia, China is engaged in day-by-day aggression against our allies and is threatening another full-scale invasion of Taiwan. And in the Middle East, Israel is fighting for its survival in the face of a war of extermination being waged against it by the Iranian regime. October 7th was the worst one-day mass murder of Jews since the Holocaust. Iran and its terrorists have attacked Israel from the Gaza Strip, from Lebanon, from Syria, from Judea and Samaria, from Yemen, from Iraq, and from Iran. And what has the Biden administration's policy been, Mr. President? Since the opening days of this administration, they have pursued an obscene policy of denying weapons to our allies while allowing resources to flow to our enemies. They immediately halted arms to our Arab allies that they were using against Iran's Houthi terrorists while lifting sanctions simultaneously on the Houthi terrorists. The Houthis immediately launched a vast offensive and today are significantly blocking shipping through the Red Sea. The administration denied critical weapons such as ATACMS to Ukraine at a period that they could have stalled Russia's offensive, providing both time and space for Iran to flood drones to be used by Russian forces against Ukraine. And of course, the Biden administration flooded unaccountable hundreds of millions of dollars into the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip, which they knew would benefit Hamas. Joe Biden sent that money to Gaza even though he was warned that the money would inevitably go to Hamas and be used for terrorism. I joined 19 senators in making that point explicitly. If you send this money to Gaza, it will be used by Hamas for terrorism, and we now know that the Biden administration agreed with me. The Biden administration concluded that it was, quote, highly likely, that is their assessment, highly likely, that the money going to Gaza would be used by Hamas for terrorism. Now, ordinarily, under U.S. anti-terrorism law, that's the end of the matter. If it's highly likely the money will be used for terrorism, you don't send it. You know what they did instead? They waived our anti-terrorism law and said, send it anyway. I guess they're okay if Hamas uses U.S. dollars to murder Israelis, because that's exactly what happened. after October 7th, the administration didn't change. Even after October 7th, the Biden administration has slowed and halted critical weapons that our Israeli allies need to counter Hamas. That utter incoherence has entangled this body. During the debate over the last national security supplemental, I and many other lawmakers found ourselves unable to support the policy, in part because we did not believe that the Biden administration would faithfully implement the authorities and appropriations Congress would be providing. Mr. President, those doubts were subsequently publicly confirmed. President Biden has explicitly said that he is blocking precision weapons to Israel, and that he would even block artillery if Israel moves to fully root out Hamas from Rafah. I'll add, Mr. President, that this policy is particularly egregious in the context of the Gaza pier, because the Biden administration requires Israelis to provide force protection for the pier while denying them the weapons they need to do so. Senate Democrats have unfortunately found themselves in the position of knowing that this policy is both incoherent and catastrophic, but at the same time, it's their party's policy, so they defend it anyway. What we should be doing is providing Israel weapons now and denying Hamas the resources it needs to continue its war of terror against Israel. That's why in a moment, I'm going to propound a unanimous consent request to ensure that the Biden administration delivers to Israel the weapons that the Biden administration is withholding. This legislation's already passed the House. In a moment, it might pass the Senate. For folks at home who are watching, you should watch very carefully. When I raise the unanimous consent request, a Democrat senator will stand up and begin speaking. He will begin by saying, reserving the right to object, and then he will give some remarks. Listen for 2 words. I object. Because this is binary. If at the end of his remarks, he says, I object, it will defeat this motion, and it will mean that Senate Democrats have decided they agree with Joe Biden in blocking weapons to Israel. And if he doesn't, if he gives the identical speech and just pulls out his pen and crosses out those 2 words written at the bottom of the speech, he just doesn't say, I object, you know what happens? The legislation that has already passed the House would pass the Senate unanimously, 100-0, and go to the president's desk for signature. Just about every member of this body goes and gives speeches and says, I support Israel. Well, talk's cheap. If you support Israel, provide them the weapons they need in a time of war. We're going to find out if the Democrats are willing to do so or not. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 398, H.R. 8369. I further ask that the bill be considered read a 3rd time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Vermont.
reserving the right to object. The war in Gaza has been a humanitarian catastrophe. Tens of thousands of civilians have been killed and wounded. Thousands of children are not able to obtain medical care that they urgently need. Hundreds of thousands of people in northern Gaza have been told to relocate again and again and again. There's no safe place for these innocent people to go in Gaza. Also, 100 precious lives of hostages do remain in Hamas control. And I am very upset about the escalation of anti-Israel sentiment here in our own country. But as everyone is painfully aware, that Hamas built its underground system of tunnels and military command beneath Gaza's schools, hospitals, and other civilian structures. Very difficult dilemma, but the answer is not the entire destruction of Gaza. And Secretary of Defense Austin said there's a better way to prosecute the military campaign than to eliminate Hamas while protecting civilians. That's our military leader. And that's a sentiment that's shared by many U.S. military officers, both active and retired, and incidentally, many Israeli officers. Israel has received, as my colleague from Texas knows, and as my colleague from Texas also knows, Israel has continued to receive massive amounts of U.S. weapons, ammunition, and other military aid. And the Congress passed an emergency supplemental in addition to the fiscal year 2024 appropriations bill. And together they provide literally billions of dollars in military aid for Israel. So the suggestion, Mr. President, that Israel is lacking for U.S. weapons and ammunition is without any merit whatsoever. The conflict between Israelis and Palestinians will not be solved with more bombs, particularly when the Netanyahu government has yet to articulate achievable goals or a credible plan for what comes next after the war ends. Something, Mr. President, that many Israeli citizens are pointing out and objecting to the manner in which Prime Minister Netanyahu is conducting this war. And in the meantime, starvation is escalating for women and children, innocent people in Gaza, who had nothing to do with what happened on October 7th. And incidentally, as the senator from Texas knows, every single one of us in the Senate is absolutely horrified by what Hamas did on that day, October 7th. And as my good friend from Texas said, that was the worst mass murder of innocent Jewish people since the Holocaust. Horrifying. I think it's fair to say that everybody in this body wants the war to end. They want a secure, peaceful Israel, and we want a secure, peaceful Palestinian state. But the suggestion that the U.S. government is not providing significant aid to Israel, which I've objected to, but this Congress has supported by a very large margin, is flat out wrong. So for these reasons, Mr. President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I move to discharge S.J. Res. 89 from the Foreign Relations Committee.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Texas, Mr. Cruz, moves to discharge S.J. Res. 89, a joint resolution to direct the termination of the use of United States.
Texas.
Mr. President, today I rise to speak on an issue that is incredibly personal and vital to millions of Americans: the protection of in vitro fertilization. IVF is a medical miracle that has brought the joy of parenthood to millions of families who might otherwise have never experienced it. I am a strong supporter of IVF, and I am incredibly grateful for the technology that has enabled parents, moms and dads desperate to bring into the world little boys and little girls, to finally hold a child in their arms. It is astounding to note that over 2% of all births in America, each and every year, come from IVF. That translates to millions of parents who've been given the chance to bring new life into the world. To date, more than 8 million babies have been born through IVF. However, recent developments have caused some confusion and concern among parents and among those who wish to be parents. The Alabama Supreme Court's decision to recognize embryos created through IVF as children under the law has left many prospective parents worried, understandably worried, about the future legality of IVF. Now, the Alabama legislature acted quickly to make clear that IVF is fully protected in the state of Alabama, but nonetheless, confusion persists. To the best of my knowledge, all 100 senators in this body support IVF. Seeing this confusion that unfortunately has been fueled by Democrat partisans, I reached out to Senator Katie Britt from Alabama. And I asked Senator Britt if she would join together in drafting legislation, federal legislation, that would be a clear, straightforward, ironclad protection for IVF. I believe we should put into federal law a clear and unambiguous protection to make clear that no state in the union can ban IVF, that no local government in this country can ban IVF. Senator Britt and I drafted this together. This bill is simple, it is straightforward, it is clear. IVF is profoundly pro-family. It is an avenue of hope for millions struggling with infertility. To every mom and every dad at home, and to every woman and man desperately hoping to be a parent, know that our bill will ensure that IVF remains 100% protected by law. And this should not just be a policy or a general affirmation. This should be a clear and unmistakable federal law. We invite our colleagues in the Senate from both sides of the aisle to join together in supporting this crucial legislation. This should be a measure that transcends political divides. A recent poll shows that 86% of Americans believe IVF should be legal and protected. This is an opportunity for us to put partisan divisions aside and to come together and unite on a shared commitment to protecting IVF. That's why in just a moment I'm going to ask unanimous consent to pass this legislation. But before I do so, I want to yield to the senator from Alabama, Senator Britt.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. I was proud to join my colleague from Texas in introducing the IVF Protection Act. I am grateful for his leadership on this important topic. Look, as a mom, I know firsthand that there's no greater joy in this life than that of being a mother. IVF helps aspiring parents across our nation experience the miracle of life and start and grow a family. That's why I strongly support continued nationwide IVF access. IVF access is fundamentally pro-family. For the millions of Americans who face infertility every year, IVF provides the hope of a pathway to parenthood. We all have loved ones, whether they're family members or friends, who have become parents or grandparents through IVF. Across America, about 2% of babies born are born because of IVF. That's about 200 babies per day. So think about the magnitude of that number and the faces and the stories and the dreams it represents. In recent decades, millions of people have been born with the help of IVF. Along with my colleague, Senator Cruz, I was honored to lead Senate Republican colleagues in a joint statement emphasizing our shared support and continued nationwide access to IVF. IVF is legal and available in every single state across America. That includes my home state, where Governor Ivey and the Alabama legislature acted quickly and overwhelmingly earlier this year to protect IVF access for our state's families. Today, the Senate has an opportunity to act quickly and overwhelmingly to protect IVF access for our nation's families. That's what the IVF Protection Act would do. It's straightforward, just as Senator Cruz has said. The bill would give aspiring parents nationwide the certainty and peace of mind that IVF will remain legal and available in every single state. Now, I want to break this down as directly as possible. First, there is only one bill that would protect IVF access and not stray outside those parameters. That's our IVF Protection Act. There's only one bill that would protect IVF access while safeguarding religious liberties. That's our IVF Protection Act. And there's only one bill, protect IVF access, that could get 60 votes in the Senate, and once again, that's our IVF Protection Act. However, that's not the bill that Democrats are going to be putting on the floor this week. Sadly, they aren't interested in a bill to actually protect IVF access and figuring out how we could get that to become law. That wouldn't advance their true goal, which is about partisan electoral politics. If Democrats allowed the IVF Protection Act to pass today, they would lose a key scare tactic they believe helps them in November. And that, ultimately, is what this is all about. They're in week 2 of their summer of scare tactics, and eventually they're going to transition into a fall of fear-mongering. At the end of the day, the American people want secure borders, they want safe streets, they want stable prices, and they want strong families. My colleagues across the aisle know that they can't sell the Biden administration's record on any of these topics. It's been failure after failure yet again. So instead, they have to rely on distorting and misrepresenting Republicans' positions on issues, including our support for IVF access. The bottom line is the American people deserve better, and there is no better path out there than our bill, the path of common ground solutions, not show votes or scare tactics. Again, I want to applaud the leadership of my colleague from Texas. Senator Cruz has been a champion as we work to make sure that the world knows that we're going to protect access to IVF. While Democrats prioritize scaring families, Republicans will continue to fight. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, sometimes the folks at home can find what happens, the parliamentary procedure on this floor, confusing. So I want to explain what's about to happen. In just a moment, I'm going to ask unanimous consent to pass the IVF protection bill into law. One of two things will happen in response. One, the Democrats in this chamber can decide that IVF should be protected by federal law, in which case this bill will pass the Senate 100-0. The other thing that might happen is Senate Democrats will utter 2 words: I object. So I want you to listen very carefully to the Senate Democrats. And whatever else is included in the speech, understand if the remarks end with the words, I object, then Senate Democrats will have made the cynical political decision that Democrats don't want IVF protected in federal law. They don't want to provide reassurance and comfort to millions of parents in America, because instead, they want to spend millions of dollars running campaign ads suggesting the big bad Republicans want to take away IVF. I get why that could be good politics. But I hope Senate Democrats are not that cynical. Understand again, if you hear the words, I object, Senate Democrats are saying, no, we will not protect IVF in federal law because we want to play politics. Mr. President, as if in legislative session, and notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the Finance Committee be discharged from further consideration of S 4368, and that the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask that the bill be considered read a 3rd time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
The Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object. I am not going to mince words here. It is ridiculous to claim that this bill protects IVF when it does nothing of the sort. In fact, it explicitly allows states to restrict IVF in all sorts of ways. It's literally in the bill text. Remember, it did not take state lawmakers in Alabama passing a ban on IVF for clinics in the state to suspend services. Under this bill, There are a million ways Republican-led states could enact burdensome and unnecessary requirements and create the kind of legal uncertainty and risk that would force clinics to once again close their doors. Also, even though it is an inherent part of the IVF process that families will make more embryos than they need, this bill does absolutely nothing, not a single thing, to ensure families who use IVF can have their clinics dispose of unused embryos without facing legal threats for a standard medical procedure. Instead, this bill completely ignores the matter of what happens to frozen embryos in order to appease Republicans' extreme anti-abortion allies. This was intentional, and it leaves the door open to a lot of chaos. So this Republican bill really is a PR tool, plain and simple. It's just another way for Republicans to pretend they are not the extremists that they keep proving they are. Meanwhile, there are bills some Republicans are pushing for right now that would enshrine as a matter of law that life begins at conception and that discarding unused embryos is essentially murder. Senator Cruz himself supported a personhood amendment to the U.S. Constitution. No way around that. The junior senator from Texas wanted to change the United States Constitution to give embryos the same rights as living, breathing human beings. Look, the stone-cold reality is that you cannot protect IVF and champion fetal personhood. So I'd like to ask my colleagues who are offering this enormously inadequate bill, and I hope they do answer directly, do you support letting parents have clinics dispose of unused embryos, which is a typical part of the IVF process? Or do you support fetal personhood, which by its very nature will throw IVF access into chaos? Because until they clearly answer that question, and it's a couple simple ones, all the claims of supporting IVF will fall obviously short, just like this bill does. That's why I object.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President.
The senator from Texas.
Mr. President, the senator from Washington suggested that this bill does not protect IVF. Let me read you the clear statutory language that unambiguously protects IVF. A state shall not prohibit in vitro fertilization as defined in Section 4B of the IVF Protection Act services, and shall ensure that no unit of local government in the state prohibits such services. That is clear, that is unambiguous, that is explicit, and that is ironclad. Had the Democrats not cynically said, "I object," that language would have just passed the United States Senate 100-0, a strong federal protection of IVF. Now, Democrats know that out of 50 states, not a single state is seeking to ban IVF. They know that the threat that they plan to spend millions of dollars trying to convince the voters is real, that no state is currently pursuing that. They know that Alabama, whose Supreme Court started this issue, the legislature promptly came into session and acted to make clear that IVF is protected. And the senator from Washington asked a question. I do find it interesting. She asked a question and wanted me to answer it, but she's no longer on the Senate floor to hear my answer to the question. But I'll answer it anyway. The senator from Washington suggests that those states that pursue personhood amendments, that is somehow inconsistent with IVF. The one problem she has is facts and reality, because there are 3 states, Alabama, Georgia, and Missouri, all of which have adopted personhood amendments, and all of which protect IVF. So IVF is legal in Alabama, it's legal in Georgia, it's legal in Missouri. So the Democrats maintain that IVF is in jeopardy, and yet the facts are precisely to the contrary. Understand why the Democrats just did what they did. Every Democrat on the ballot is going to tell the voters, if you don't vote for me, a Democrat, mean Republicans are going to come take away IVF. And I'll tell you, Mr. President, the reason they're going to say that is because the Democrats' record on abortion is extreme and out of the mainstream. Every Democrat senator in this body has voted for legislation that would legalize abortion literally up until the moment of birth, up to and including the 39th and 40th week of pregnancy. That is radical. Only 9% of Americans support the extreme policy position of Senate Democrats on abortion. 91% of Americans look at that and say, that goes too far. Even among those Americans who call themselves pro-choice, a majority of pro-choice Americans look at the position of the Democrats and they say, wow, abortion up until the moment of delivery in the 9th month of pregnancy, that is too much. So what is the Democrats' political strategy? Don't talk about their actual record on abortion. Instead, try to change the topic to last week, contraception, and this week, IVF. And they know that no state in the union is trying to ban contraception and that no state in the union is trying to ban IVF. Every single senator in this body supports the right to contraception. Every single senator in this body supports IVF being protected. But the Democrats are counting on a docile media to pick up their message and carry their message. They know that the bills we are voting on tomorrow will fail. That's not a bug, it's a feature. They want the bills tomorrow to fail. Why? Because this is all about running TV ads, claiming Republicans are opposed to IVF. They know it is false. And by the way, one of the reasons the bills will fail tomorrow is they deliberately trample on religious liberty. You know, there used to be a time when there was a bipartisan commitment to religious liberty, but no longer. The Democrats have decided that the First Amendment to the Constitution no longer matters. And so the Democrats' bill would, among other things, force a Catholic hospital to provide IVF procedures, even if it was contrary to the faith of Catholic doctors performing the procedure. Now, our bill does not seek to force anyone to do anything. We all have a right to live according to our faith, so if your faith teaches you not to use IVF as a doctor, you should have the right to say, I'm not going to participate in that. But understand, the Cruz legislation that the Democrats just cynically objected to would protect IVF for every parent in the country. And it would become federal law except for one thing. The Democrats do not want it to. Because if we pass clear, strong federal protections for IVF, the issue that they're planning to campaign on would go away. What we've just seen is one of the most cynical displays of partisan politics to ever occur on the Senate floor. It's designed deliberately to deceive the American voters. It's unfortunate that Democrats put politics above protecting parents and above protecting IVF. But just remember, the next time you hear a Democrat saying, and they're going to spend millions of dollars saying it, we're the ones who want to protect IVF, understand, we could have passed strong federal legislation today, but Senate Democrats don't want a protection of IVF. They want a campaign issue. I yield the floor. President, I rise at a time of widespread and acute peril for the national security of the United States and for America's allies. Led by China, our enemies and our adversaries, Russia, Iran, North Korea, are actively cooperating to target us and our allies all over the world. In extreme cases, Mr. President, they seek nothing less than the physical annihilation of the countries they're targeting. In Europe, Russia has launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In Asia, China is engaged in day-by-day aggression against our allies and is threatening another full-scale invasion of Taiwan. And in the Middle East, Israel is fighting for its survival in the face of a war of extermination being waged against it by the Iranian regime. October 7th was the worst one-day mass murder of Jews since the Holocaust. Iran and its terrorists have attacked Israel from the Gaza Strip, from Lebanon, from Syria, from Judea and Samaria, from Yemen, from Iraq, and from Iran. And what has the Biden administration's policy been, Mr. President? Since the opening days of this administration, they have pursued an obscene policy of denying weapons to our allies while allowing resources to flow to our enemies. They immediately halted arms to our Arab allies that they were using against Iran's Houthi terrorists while lifting sanctions simultaneously on the Houthi terrorists. The Houthis immediately launched a vast offensive and today are significantly blocking shipping through the Red Sea. The administration denied critical weapons such as ATACMS to Ukraine at a period that they could have stalled Russia's offensive, providing both time and space for Iran to flood drones to be used by Russian forces against Ukraine. And of course, the Biden administration flooded unaccountable hundreds of millions of dollars into the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip, which they knew would benefit Hamas. Joe Biden sent that money to Gaza even though he was warned that the money would inevitably go to Hamas and be used for terrorism. I joined 19 senators in making that point explicitly. If you send this money to Gaza, it will be used by Hamas for terrorism, and we now know that the Biden administration agreed with me. The Biden administration concluded that it was, quote, highly likely, that is their assessment, highly likely, that the money going to Gaza would be used by Hamas for terrorism. Now, ordinarily, under U.S. anti-terrorism law, that's the end of the matter. If it's highly likely the money will be used for terrorism, you don't send it. You know what they did instead? They waived our anti-terrorism law and said, send it anyway. I guess they're okay if Hamas uses U.S. dollars to murder Israelis, because that's exactly what happened. After October 7th, the administration didn't change. Even after October 7th, the Biden administration has slowed and halted critical weapons that our Israeli allies need to counter Hamas. That utter incoherence has entangled this body. During the debate over the last national security supplemental, I and many other lawmakers found ourselves unable to support the policy, in part because we did not believe that the Biden administration would faithfully implement the authorities and appropriations Congress would be providing. Mr. President, those doubts were subsequently publicly confirmed. President Biden has explicitly said that he is blocking precision weapons to Israel, and that he would even block artillery if Israel moves to fully root out Hamas from Rafah. I'll add, Mr. President, that this policy is particularly egregious in the context of the Gaza pier, because the Biden administration requires Israelis to provide force protection for the pier while denying them the weapons they need to do so. Senate Democrats have unfortunately found themselves in the position of knowing that this policy is both incoherent and catastrophic, but at the same time, it's their party's policy, so they defend it anyway. What we should be doing is providing Israel weapons now and denying Hamas the resources it needs to continue its war of terror against Israel. That's why in a moment, I'm going to propound a unanimous consent request to ensure that the Biden administration delivers to Israel the weapons that the Biden administration is withholding. This legislation's already passed the House. In a moment, it might pass the Senate. For folks at home who are watching, you should watch very carefully. when I raise the unanimous consent request, a Democrat senator will stand up and begin speaking. He will begin by saying, reserving the right to object, and then he will give some remarks. Listen for 2 words. I object. Because this is binary. If at the end of his remarks, he says, I object, it will defeat this motion, and it will mean that Senate Democrats have decided they agree with Joe Biden in blocking weapons to Israel. And if he doesn't, if he gives the identical speech and just pulls out his pen and crosses out those 2 words written at the bottom of the speech, he just doesn't say, I object, you know what happens? The legislation that has already passed the House would pass the Senate unanimously, 100-0, and go to the president's desk for signature. Just about every member of this body goes and gives speeches and says, I support Israel. Well, talk's cheap. If you support Israel, provide them the weapons they need in a time of war. We're going to find out if the Democrats are willing to do so or not. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 398, H.R. 8369. I further ask that the bill be considered read a 3rd time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Vermont.
reserving the right to object. The war in Gaza has been a humanitarian catastrophe. Tens of thousands of civilians have been killed and wounded. Thousands of children are not able to obtain medical care that they urgently need. Hundreds of thousands of people in northern Gaza have been told to relocate again and again and again. There's no safe place for these innocent people to go in Gaza. Also, 100 precious lives of hostages do remain in Hamas control. And I am very upset about the escalation of anti-Israel sentiment here in our own country. But as everyone is painfully aware, that Hamas built its underground system of tunnels and military command beneath Gaza's schools, hospitals, and other civilian structures. Very difficult dilemma, but the answer is not the entire destruction of Gaza. And Secretary of Defense Austin said there's a better way to prosecute the military campaign than to eliminate Hamas while protecting civilians. That's our military leader. And that's a sentiment that's shared by many U.S. military officers, both active and retired, and incidentally, many Israeli officers. Israel has received, as my colleague from Texas knows, and as my colleague from Texas also knows, Israel has continued to receive massive amounts of U.S. weapons, ammunition, and other military aid. And the Congress passed an emergency supplemental in addition to the fiscal year 2024 appropriations bill. And together they provide literally billions of dollars in military aid for Israel. So the suggestion, Mr. President, that Israel is lacking for U.S. weapons and ammunition is without any merit whatsoever. The conflict between Israelis and Palestinians will not be solved with more bombs, particularly when the Netanyahu government has yet to articulate achievable goals or a credible plan for what comes next after the war ends. Something, Mr. President, that many Israeli citizens are pointing out and objecting to the manner in which Prime Minister Netanyahu is conducting this war. And in the meantime, starvation is escalating for women and children, innocent people in Gaza, who had nothing to do with what happened on October 7th. And incidentally, as the senator from Texas knows, every single one of us in the Senate is absolutely horrified by what Hamas did on that day, October 7th. And as my good friend from Texas said, that was the worst mass murder of innocent Jewish people since the Holocaust. Horrifying. I think it's fair to say that everybody in this body wants the war to end. They want a secure, peaceful Israel, and we want a secure, peaceful Palestinian state. But the suggestion that the U.S. government is not providing significant aid to Israel, which I've objected to, but this Congress has supported by a very large margin, is flat out wrong. So for these reasons, Mr. President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I move to discharge S.J. Res. 89 from the Foreign Relations Committee.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Texas, Mr. Cruz, moves to discharge S.J. Res. 89, a joint resolution to direct the termination of the use of United States Armed Forces and so forth from the Committee on Foreign Relations.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, the Gaza Pier is a perfect example of the Biden administration's foreign policy incoherence. This was a nearly $500 million stunt trying to buy a few votes in Michigan. It's been an unconscionable waste of American taxpayer dollars. And simultaneously, it has undermined America's geopolitical credibility with our allies. The pier is unnecessary. We can debate whether sufficient aid is getting to the Gaza Strip. But I believe that our Israeli allies have taken unprecedented steps to ensure that indeed there is. I understand that many Democrats disagree. What is undeniable, however, is that whatever aid is coming in, it has not, will not, and indeed could not have come through this godforsaken pier. The operation was simply too insignificant and too convoluted. Moreover, we know that Hamas diverts aid delivered through this pier. The pier has also been reportedly attacked by Palestinian terrorists, and 3 U.S. service members have been injured because of pier operations. Further, the pier has cost American taxpayers a minimum of $320 million to construct. And that was an estimate from April, so it is surely higher now. Meanwhile, we have required our Israeli allies to provide a, quote, security bubble around the pier. We are pressuring them to protect this operation, which is bringing supplies hijacked by Hamas. And Mr. President, Joe Biden is asking Israel to protect the Gaza Pier from Hamas while denying Israel the weapons to counter Hamas. And as we just saw, Senate Democrats are endorsing that policy. I find it difficult, Mr. President, to think of a more ridiculous policy. Let's be clear. American policy should be unequivocal. We need to ensure that Israel has the military and diplomatic support to utterly eradicate Hamas. That's good for Israel and it's good for America. Unfortunately, we've seen a recurring theme from the Biden administration and from Senate Democrats. Undermine Israel at every step of the way and aid terrorists at every step of the way. In fact, this administration has been the greatest friend to Hamas and Hezbollah and the greatest ally to the Ayatollah Khamenei on the entire planet. Under the Biden presidency, over $100 billion has flowed to Iran. $6 billion of it was in ransom for 5 Americans, a policy which I warned at the time would lead to more Americans taken hostage. Tragically, on October 7th, we saw that come to pass. Where we are now is the Biden administration is sending money to Gaza, and they're combining it with blocking weapons to Israel. The policy is utterly backwards. If you ask anyone on the street, what should we do on foreign policy, they would say we should support our friends and stand up to our enemies. Unfortunately, Joe Biden and the Democrats, their policy is block weapons to our friends, block weapons to Israel, and send billions of dollars to our enemies who are actively trying to kill Israelis and actively trying to kill Americans. It is Alice in Wonderland through the looking glass. Now, what the Senate should be doing is voting on the legislation the House has already passed to provide the weapons Israel needs now. Just a minute ago, I tried to pass that here on the floor of the Senate, and you saw Senate Democrats object to that. Why is it that we're not voting right now on providing weapons to Israel that Joe Biden has blocked? Because Senate Democrats do not want to vote on it. The only reason it didn't pass a minute ago is that a Senate Democrat objected and did so on behalf of all of the Democrats, and we know that it is all of the Democrats. Because Chuck Schumer is the majority leader of this body, Senator Schumer could schedule the House bill for a vote anytime he wants, and he said he will not allow it to come to a vote. So understand, if you support Israel, the reason the Biden administration is able to block weapons from going to Israel is because every Senate Democrat is standing in solidarity with this White House, blocking weapons from going to Israel in a time of war. The reason you heard the words, "I object," is some Senate Democrats don't want to go on the record for that. They don't want to actually cast the vote. The senator who objected is from the state of Vermont. Vermont is a bright blue state, a state that they comfortably believe is safe to make an objection. Senators who are on the ballot in red or more purple states are not eager to go on record on this question. Procedurally, I do not have the ability to force a vote on passing the already passed House bill that would provide immediate weapons to Israel. There's not a procedural vehicle to do that, but there is a procedural vehicle to vote on the mirror image of that policy. If we can't vote saying America should provide weapons to our friend, the state of Israel, what we can vote on is we should stop giving money to our enemies, to Hamas. The Gaza pier is flowing money to Gaza that is benefiting Hamas. And under the War Powers Act, I have the ability procedurally to force a vote, which we're about to have, on whether to cut off that money. Everyone at home, I want you to understand, this is a vote, yes, on the Gaza pier, yes, on cutting off money to Hamas, but it's also a vote on the other half of the policy, should we provide weapons to Israel? I would have more than happily withdrawn this War Powers resolution if the Democrat majority would allow a vote on the legislation that's already passed the House providing immediate weapons to Israel. But Democrat leadership doesn't want that vote. So I'm going to force the only vote we can get. And understand, when you see Democrat after Democrat after Democrat walk down to the well of the Senate and vote, and I'm going to make a prediction, they're going to vote quietly. You may see a couple who have been among the loudest opponents of Israel. A couple may vote loudly. But most Democrats are going to walk in very quietly and go to the clerk and go, no. Maybe point down quietly, but it's not going to be a vote they're proud of. It's going to be a vote that they hope their constituents don't know about. They hope that the men and women they represent don't hear about. And it's going to be a vote, sadly, that simply reflects party loyalty, that the Biden White House has cracked the whip and said, we support our enemies, we oppose our friends, now fall in line and vote accordingly. I'm hoping that Senate Democrats will rediscover that the Senate is an independent body, that the Senate doesn't work for the White House, even if your own party is in charge. That the Senate was designed to provide checks and balances on the president, especially concerning foreign policy. That the Senate is given by the framers of our Constitution unique responsibilities concerning foreign policy. The responsibility to declare war, the responsibility to ratify treaties, the responsibility to confirm ambassadors, to confirm the Secretary of State, to confirm military officers. The framers designed the Senate to check an executive, whether from your own party or the opposing party. There was a long history of Senate Democrats who were willing to stand up to Democrat presidents. You know, there was a Senate Democrat named Scoop Jackson. Scoop Jackson actually had the courage to stand up, even if it was a Democrat president, and fight for American national security. I wish we had even one Scoop Jackson Democrat left in the Senate. Even one Democrat who would stand up and say, look, I'm with the Biden White House most of the time. But on cutting off weapons to Israel, on funding Gaza, on sending money to Iran and Hamas, enough is enough, I can't do that. It's within the prerogative of every senator to do just that. And I would note it's possible. You know, we just had a Senate Judiciary markup. Where going into the markup, everyone assumed that a judicial nominee from New York was going to be voted favorably out of the Judiciary Committee. Now, this was a particularly radical nominee. This is a nominee who, as a magistrate judge, had ordered a 6'2" biological man who is a serial repeat rapist to be housed at a women's prison, putting every woman in that prison at risk of sexual assault or rape. It's an extreme and radical nominee. I and others led the opposition to it. I will tell you, we just had the markup. We walked into the markup, and everyone assumed, as has happened for 3.5 years, that the Democrats would vote like the Politburo, and vote for whatever extreme nominee was in front of us, and something shocking happened. When the vote happened, one of the Democrat senators, Democrat senator from Georgia, voted no. The nominee was defeated. I'm going to point to that as an example to the Democrats in this chamber. I understand the White House expects you to fall in line, that President Biden is coming to join you for lunch today. But every senator has the prerogative to make your own choice. Do you agree with undermining Israel? Do you agree with flowing money to Gaza and Hamas and Iran and terrorists who want to kill us? And if you don't, the people of your state have elected you and given you the prerogative and given you the voice to stand up and say no to this policy that is endangering America and endangering our allies. I urge every member, Republican and Democrat, to stand together united. It would be powerful if we saw a bipartisan vote saying, we stand with our friends and we stand against our enemies, and enough with this nonsense of funding people who want to kill us. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, just to alert our colleagues, it's my intentions at the end of this debate to make a point of order that this joint resolution is not entitled to privilege under 50 U.S.C. 1546A due to U.S. troops not being engaged in hostilities. But in order to allow the debate to continue, I'll withhold that motion until the end of discussions. This resolution that's before us would be an unprecedented invocation of the expedited procedures in the War Powers Resolution. I'm a strong supporter of the War Powers. I think it's an appropriate use of congressional oversight on our powers to commit our troops to harm's way. This resolution does not seek to remove U.S. forces from hostility, but rather to end a specific mission. The War Powers is to deal with our military troops, not to deal with tactical military and non-military actions. The Senate should not allow the privileged vehicle intended for entirely different purposes to be used as a backdoor efforts to stop humanitarian assistance. So let me be clear about this. American boots are not on the ground in Gaza. U.S. troops are operating the pier in question, are not engaged in hostilities or carrying out a mission that requires the authorization of the use of military force. They are facilitating the delivery of food, water, and other basic humanitarian assistance. The supplies are not even being delivered by U.S. forces. Let me just call to our colleagues' attention what is included in the War Powers Act itself. It deals where United States armed forces are in hostilities or in situations where imminent involvement in hostilities are clearly indicated by the circumstances and continued to use of such forces in hostility or in such situations. That's not what we have here in regards to the pier. So this is not the appropriate use of the War Powers Act. I might tell you this is somewhat moot because we expect by the end of this month the pier operations are going to cease. But in any event, I think it's important for this body to make clear we support the War Powers. This is not an appropriate use of the War Powers, and for that reason I will be making a motion at the end of a point of order. But I understand some other colleagues have some points, so I'll yield the floor, but I will ask for the floor before the end of the debate.
Mr. President.
Senator from West Virginia.
Mr. President, I rise in support of Senator Cardin and basically the concerns we have with the War Powers Act and diminishing that to the point that we can't really react to the needs that we have around the world, not only defend ourselves but help our allies. I agree also with Senator Cruz that this pier has not worked. It has not done what it was intended to do. Difficult conditions, a lot of money has been spent, but to go any further is needless. And I am going to intend to enter into a resolution, have a resolution for today that basically will do exactly what Senator Cruz has said in his, except we'll do it in the sense of the Senate versus invoking the War Powers Act. And I will ask for the consent and hopefully support of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. That'll be later. We'll do it today before we leave.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
From West Virginia. I think you're going about it, my colleague is going about it the right way, dealing with the substance of the issue through a resolution and not invoking the authorities we have for expedited procedures under the War Powers Act. And for that reason, Mr. President, I make a point of order. For that reason, Mr. President, I intend later to make a point of order. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Texas.
Mr. President, the senator from Maryland said that he intends to raise a point of order objecting to this War Powers resolution because we do not have service members in harm's way. We do not have active hostilities, which is what is required by the War Powers Act. That is a creative procedural argument. It just has the inconvenient fact of not being true. And not only is it not true, but what the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee is arguing to this body is directly contrary to the explicit position of the Biden Department of Defense. I want to read to you from a press briefing from the Biden Department of Defense on May 16th. A reporter asked the official spokesperson for the Department of Defense, question, quote, "The USAID spokesperson said yesterday that he wasn't satisfied yet with the deconfliction arrangement yet. And then he added that the maritime corridors exposed to, we do not think the JLOTS of the maritime corridor is exposed to any additional risk above and beyond that which is already present in Gaza." That's pretty frightening now, isn't it? Given how many people have been killed. Answer, and this is from the Biden Department of Defense, quote, "I don't think we've come up here with rose-colored glasses and said, this is not a risk. This is an active war zone." The Biden Department of Defense has explicitly stated this is an active war zone, that they are putting U.S. personnel at risk. And that is precisely what the War Powers Act gives this body the ability to act. I would note as well, my friend from West Virginia said he wanted a sense of the Senate, but not to use the War Powers Act. The War Powers Act is a way for Congress to exercise its prerogative. Over recent decades, we've seen the Senate hand away much of our responsibility on foreign policy and national security to the executive. That is contrary to the design of our Constitution, and it's frankly harmful to the Senate and harmful to this country. We are not merely a body that has a sense of the Senate. Look, I assume I will join whatever sense of the Senate. If it says this is a dumb idea, I'll join that. But while we're at it, we ought to rename a post office. The Senate exists to do more important things than make general musings into the ether. The Senate has the constitutional power, and under the War Powers Act, the legal and statutory power to say, stop spending money to send U.S. servicemen and women into harm's way. Now, far too often, the Senate has stepped out of our historic role in foreign policy, has said whatever the president wants, we, the Senate, aren't going to say anything about it. When there's a Republican president, Democrat senators suddenly discover their voice and say, hey, the Senate ought to say something. But when it's a Democrat president, it seems no matter how incoherent and disastrous the foreign policy from the Democrat president, Democrat senators don't want the Senate to exercise its authority. I'll reiterate the offer that I made just moments ago to the staff of the Senate Majority Leader. I will withdraw this War Powers resolution if the Senate votes on the legislation that has already passed the House to provide the weapons that the Biden White House is blocking to Israel. The Democrats don't want to do that because they don't want their members on record. And because they don't want their members on record, this is the only vehicle I have. Because procedurally, under the statute, I have a right to force a vote on this. Chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee said there are not active hostilities. The Biden Department of Defense has explicitly disagreed. To quote again, I don't think we've come up here with rose-colored glasses and said that this is not a risk. This is an active war zone. That means the War Powers Act fully applies. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The senator from Maryland.
there is no dispute that there's active hostilities in Gaza. That's not the issue. The question is whether American troops have been engaged in that hostility, and they are not. That's when the War Powers Act is triggered. American presence through missions are common in areas surrounding active hostilities. That is not unusual. So the use of the War Powers Act in these circumstances would be unprecedented. And I would urge my colleagues to recognize there are other ways we can express ourselves. I thank Senator Manchin for giving us that opportunity, but this is the wrong procedure to use. And if all time is yielded back, I yield the floor.
A very brief response
Senator
to what
from
my
Texas.
A very brief response to what my friend from Maryland said. The pier was fired upon twice. It is difficult to say that we're not in active hostilities when we are being fired upon. And so it clearly falls under the statute. And with that, I yield all further time.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
In brief rebuttal, I would tell you a mission dealing with humanitarian assistance is not introducing our soldiers. Mr. President, I make a point of order. I yield back our time, and I make a point of order that this joint resolution is not entitled to privilege under 50 U.S.C. 1546A due to U.S. troops not being engaged in hostilities.
The chair submits the question to the Senate for its decision. Is the point of order well taken?
Ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Brown, Mr. Budd, Ms. Butler, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin,